webinar started, and I'll announce. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to wait just 2 minutes to let others join, and then we'll begin today's conversation. Welcome, everyone, to the October installment of our monthly webinar series, Postsecondary Pathways, hosted by the Hunt Institute. Our topic of discussion for today is revisiting our FAFSA conversation from previous webinars and is focused on examining the impacts of delayed FAFSA on students and institutions. I am Dr. Waverly Wissenamp, Deputy Director of Higher Education at the Hunt Institute. For those unfamiliar with the Institute, we were founded by a 4-term North Carolina Governor, Jim Hunt, and serve as a resource for policymakers on education issues from prenatal through higher education. The Hunt Institute is a national nonprofit dedicated to supporting and advising education leaders and policymakers nationwide on education issues across the continuum by offering in-person and virtual convenings, conducting research, and offering other forms of technical assistance to states across the country. Before getting the conversation started, I want to provide a brief logistical overview. We'll start with a moderated discussion with our panelists and then pivot to a Q&A with the audience. If you have any questions throughout the discussion, please feel free to submit them using the Q&A feature on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll do our best to address those during the discussion. Additionally, we will record this conversation and in the next couple of days, post it to our YouTube channel. And speaking of today's conversation, we are so appreciative to the experts who are joining us to discuss the challenges students and institutions face as a result of the delayed FAFSA, and to the country who will help us frame the topic of impact. So to give a little framework of what our conversation will be about, the completion of FAFSA is critical for ensuring students have full access to the slate of available federal and state aid. The new FAFSA rollout presented challenges for students who relied on knowing what aid they will or would be eligible for to inform their decision on how to enroll. Knowing these challenges, the webinar will discuss how institutions of higher education responded to those needs of their diverse students and implemented structures to support their success in completing the new FAFSA for achieving high-quality degrees or credentials. And we'll also have experts discussing from a student lens. Further, this session will specifically examine the challenges to FAFSA completion for those students in higher education and address ways in which institutions can support students in completing FAFSA and receiving financial aid. So our 3 experts are Dr. Juan S. Ramirez, Associate Outreach Director of Special Populations and Immigration from the College Foundation of North Carolina, or CFNC. We also have Mark Kantrowitz, financial aid expert and best-selling author, joining us, and Angela O'Donnell, Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy from the Institute for College Access and Success. So we will first start with Dr. Ramirez. So Dr. Ramirez was born in Medellin, Colombia, and settled in the foothills in the Appalachian Mountains in western North Carolina in 2000. As a newcomer, he experienced firsthand the contradictions and ambiguities attached to certain groups in the United States, including a crucial moment of realization of belonging to the Latinx or Hispanic community. His research interest lies in the intersection of race, ethnicity, and education. His mission has been sharing across the state the transformative power of education. Dr. Ramirez advocates for the inclusion of all lived experiences, crafting intentional spaces in which we are teachers and learners, and bringing to attention the great cultural wealth that immigrant communities bring to their spaces. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Ramirez. So, Dr. Ramirez, in what ways might the FAFSA delay disproportionately influence the enrollment decisions of students impacted by immigration compared to their peers?
Thank you so much for the introduction, and I appreciate all of us spending a little bit of time to highlight this topic and this issue. I think that's one of the positive things that the FAFSA delays did, was to bring awareness to some of the inequities that we have in terms of working with different types of students. So I have the privilege of traveling across the state, just hearing and working with students and families around FAFSA, financial aid, and all of those pieces that make families and students inform stakeholders of their process. So I'm just really excited to be here. So just to answer in a very briefly the question, I think that it has been catastrophic to know about the delays with FAFSA and all the ripple effects it has had on students and families, including the anxiety about the uncertainty of opportunities available, funding opportunities available, the fear and the burden for them to put their families in a place where they cannot afford college. Also in North Carolina, for example, we have state funding that is also tied into the FAFSA form. So not only students are not able to receive federal information, but also state funding information. In North Carolina, we tried a different approach and being a little bit more transparent about it, so people can actually go and figure out how much funding they could get, but that's not the case in every situation. So what that also one of the impacts is the available funding that students would have access to, not only in terms of grants, but also scholarships. Of course, many colleges and universities do rely on the FAFSA information to be able to provide financial aid award letters. And so the delayed also the colleges don't have what they need to be able to process that information, and therefore it goes into deadlines and it goes into the timelines that colleges and universities have in order to do enrollment. And then the final piece relates to the additional burdens and stressors that come um, to the form, especially as it relates to working with large number of first generation students. And that's the case. That's particularly my case, where I get to work with a lot of first generation students, students that are not necessarily native English speakers, or maybe their families are not native speakers or speakers of other languages other than English. And then, of course, the navigational capital, understanding the terminology and understanding the how to navigate these complex financial aid terms and financial aid processes. So to answer very briefly that question, it's catastrophic, but also the ripple effects that we're gonna continue to have, they're not gonna go away. So I think I'm gonna leave it for that, and then we'll have some opportunities and some solutions in another question.
Thank you, Dr. Ramirez. Now let me introduce our next resource expert, Mark Kantrowitz. Mark Kantrowitz is a nationally recognized expert on student financial aid, scholarships, student loans, college savings plans, and education tax benefits. His mission is to deliver practical information, advice, and tools to students and their families so they can make informed decisions about planning and paying for college. Mark writes extensively about student financial aid policy. He has testified before Congress and federal state agencies about aid on several occasions. Mark is also the president of Cerebly Inc., formerly MK Consulting Inc., a consulting firm focused on computer science, artificial intelligence, and statistical and policy analysis. Mark, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, Mark, what policy interventions might be necessary to mitigate the adverse effects of future FAFSA delays on students in higher education institutions?
Well, let's look at the negative impacts that were experienced last year. And there are still 25 open, unresolved issues that haven't been resolved, including impacts on members of the military who live outside the US, students who come from mixed status families or where their parents are both undocumented or not US citizens. And a student who is a US citizen is eligible for federal student aid, regardless of the identity verification requirement, which was brand new. The previous year, they didn't need to confirm their identity, and only 39% of the families were able to complete it. Now, they've waived it for this upcoming year, but they still haven't developed an effective solution. People who file tax returns using an ITIN instead of a social security number haven't been able to transfer the data, so they must submit the data manually, which subjects them to verification of that data as opposed to getting the data from the IRS. The FAFSA was supposed to be available in 11 languages, but it was only available in English and Spanish. And it doesn't seem like they're going to have that this year. There was a problem with transparency. They were telling us all is well, when in fact they knew that things were had problems, even as they were rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. For example, the call center staffing was inadequate. They dropped 3/4 of the calls and didn't respond to them. So they only answered 1.4 million of the 5.4 million calls over the first several months. And another concern is that there's about a 10% decline in the number of high school seniors submitting the FAFSA. These students will not be enrolling in college, and they may be permanently lost to post-secondary education. And if you have a 10% decline in college enrollment that persists year after year, it may cause colleges to close. And we're already seeing one college closing every week. So they need to get the job done. They need to implement the FAFSA correctly and completely and not lie to us about the problems. And they need to do outreach to the families that were affected by it. And they need to, starting next year, because this year they're still have a more than 60-day delay in the FAFSA becoming available, they need to return to an October 1st start date with a fully functional FAFSA.
Thank you so much for outlining some of those reasons and causes for the delay, as well as what should be done. So next we have Angela O'Donnell, our next resource expert. Angela leads the state policy efforts on higher education access, affordability, and success for the Institute of College Access and Success. She is committed to student and community-centered efforts that improve access navigation, simplifying processes, and financial resource allocation to ensure that post-secondary credential attainment is a reality for all students equitably. Prior to joining TCAS, Angela worked in college access and success strategy development and professional development by way of Collective Impact at Detroit College Access Network and as the Deputy Director and Acting Executive Director. She also has 8 years of experience in financial aid as a financial aid administrator and assistant director in both public and private institutions in Michigan and out of state. So Angela, thank you for being here, and I'll ask you your question. What effects has the FAFSA delay had on students, families, and student supports? And then can you speak to policy efforts as
Oh, absolutely. And thank you for the introduction. So just by way of overall background, I had a unique experience in financial aid. So I didn't just work as an administrative advisor for an institution. A bulk of my time was also for an outreach team where we actually went out and did the FAFSA nights, FAFSA drives, and things of that nature. So I've actually worked with thousands of families despite what institutions or pathways they were interested in. So I really keep a close monitoring on the FAFSA improvements and some of the avocation that happened along the way. So how did this FAFSA delay actually impact students and families? I think it really jilted the aspect of culture around higher education and the value of higher education. From a student and family perspective, especially from vulnerable communities, they believe that we're all working together to make sure that things run smoothly for them. So when these type of things happen, it not only damages the relationship with the federal connection in alignment when completing the FAFSA, but those who are providing supports to them, their schools, and just the overall, what's the point of going post-secondary? Because I keep running into these hangups and hiccups. And that is one of the biggest challenges right now, especially in vulnerable spaces, is trying to prove to them that there is value in getting credentials beyond a high school diploma. But when things like this happen, it makes the job of those who are in student supports that much harder, and trying to convince them to sit down and work through the hangups, to try to sit and work through the fact that something may not work today, please come back tomorrow and try it again. And that can be really taxing to those student support personnel, especially in vulnerable communities where capacity is low, resources are low. They are already limited in their ability to actually support the students, but then have to put in 10 times the work to get them to complete steps that are going to be valuable for them in the long run. So, and then from the institutional standpoint, the students are not going to look at the federal government in the hangup. They're going to look at the institution. Why don't you have answers? Why didn't you do this? And they're in the space, in the same space as those who are supporting them in the K-12 and CBO space as well. So just being mindful of that, like that was also a burden. Institutions did not get the actual records on time. Some of them still don't have their correction forms for any students who have to go in and correct the application. They are at a stall as well in being positioned to be able to help students. So the other element, I didn't know if you, in terms of the policy, like what we're seeing from a policy front, and this is more so because I lead the Michigan team for TICAS, born, raised, educated, first gen, low income from the city of Detroit as well. So not only is this a body of my career, it is also a body of my experience, direct experience as a student. And from a policy standpoint, there are about 15 states who have passed legislation around universal FAFSA requirements, either by graduation requirement and or just by encouragement to prioritize FAFSA completion within the state. Only about half of those states have actually put it into action because they have like lag time in terms of like which class it would start with for the other states. And for those states who had a requirement, a state mandate in place, they actually fared better than some of the other states across the nation with the hiccups because they already put in a system of prioritization and programming and training and wraparound supports that families need ahead of the downfall of the FAFSA delays that happened this past year. So they're a little more equipped, not any better than some, like they weren't able to navigate the challenges that were there, but they were better positioned to inform families, to support families, and to get families to understand the importance of completing this application in a way that some other states weren't. So Michigan also has a bill. So in looking at these bills, it's not just a matter of saying that this is a requirement for students, but making sure that those protections are there as well. So in Michigan in particular, we have all types of opt-outs, so it won't keep a student from graduating. There's also like a requirement for the state to make sure it's provided in multiple languages. We actually have funding. We're one of the few states that actually have a funding line item in our state budget, specifically for FAFSA supports. There's a $10 million budget line item in Michigan that schools can tap into to be able to help with programming and resources around that. So there are active agents within these respective spaces that are trying to find ways to better support students, because we do understand the value of them accessing those resources and seeing the possibility of themselves being able to move forward.
Thank you so much for sharing those items and your experience, Angela. And as a reminder to the audience, you are welcome to submit questions using that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. So you can just click on that button and then type in any of those questions you might have that are sparked from this discussion. So I have another question for our panelists before opening the floor for Q&A. And I'll ask it broadly, and then I'll start with Dr. Ramirez, followed by Mark, and then Angela. So what long-term trends in higher education could emerge if FAFSA delays become more frequent or prolonged? And how can we work to avoid the exacerbation of these trends? Dr.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for what my colleagues mentioned. But I do want to mention that our students are bright. Our students are smart. They care about not putting the burden on their families. And even if we're not seeing that translate directly to FAFSA completion, it doesn't mean that the students are not starting the FAFSA form. So I just wanted to make sure that we make that very clear, because sometimes we look at the data and we see the completion numbers and we blame the students or their families, but in fact, they have been working since the day that it opens, in one issue after the other issue. So just want to make sure that we know that. So in North Carolina, specifically in the foundation that I'm part of, we actually changed our strategy a little bit in terms of aligning with the future trends, which is basically we can't do this work alone. We have to do it with everyone else. And so what that means is a lot of the individuals that were serving our community were nonprofit partners, were, people that were willing to help out. They just did not have the training necessary to be able to do that. So one of the things that shifting that model, we started more train the trainer kind of program across the state, where we are increasing the capacity and creating college access teams across the state to be able to support students in that way, and providing expert resources and funding sometimes. That includes nonprofit leaders, that includes community organizations, colleges, universities, and even counselors, because a lot of times with the group that I work with, they don't necessarily know that there is an eligibility requirement for you to receive FAFSA. So just making sure that people understand that eligibility in terms of immigration and the impact that immigration has on the opportunities for students. We also did stipends over the summer, because we know that many of the colleges are working with limited personnel during the summer. So providing funding for counselors and for experienced community leaders to support that. And then actually doing a lot more of data-informed decision-making. So where are we seeing the biggest opportunities in terms of population? So one of the things that Mark mentioned, for example, was mixed status households, right? So they were greatly impacted by this FAFSA rollout. So one of the things that we tried to do was we tried to do FAFSA fiestas across North Carolina, where we made it fun. We made it welcoming for the families and the students to come in with their family. And instead of being like a draining task, to be more like a celebration of the community. So changing a little bit of the trend and seeing that we don't have necessarily the time. So therefore we have increased the intensity of which we are operating. So for example, one of the things that we are doing now, it's doing a lot more FAFSA planning. So starting really early with the students and families to make sure that they understand what the FAFSA is, what are you able to get, what are the requirements, what do you need to complete the FAFSA, and then once we're ready, then we're doing completion events to make sure that we can complete those FAFSA forms. So I'm seeing like little glimpse of hope with all of this, but I think that our organization already started aligning with some of these things because we don't have the time. We need the time and we don't have it. And we're just trying to do everything we can to make sure that our students have a good opportunity.
Thank you. So Mark, I'll read the question again, and then I'll give it back to you. So what long-term trends in higher education could emerge if FAFSA delays become more frequent or prolonged? And how can we work to avoid the exacerbation of these trends?
Right. So if you want to predict the weather tomorrow, look out the window today. And right now, we have a FAFSA that is still delayed. Not as badly, hopefully, as last year. And last year, the launch was officially delayed by 90 days until December 30th, but it really wasn't consistently available until January 7th. That's 98 days delay. And then the processing of the student records didn't occur until March 10th, so that's a 161-day delay. And students weren't able to make corrections until April 15th. That's 197 days. And the U.S. Department of Education didn't start processing paper FAFSA forms until August 1st, a 305-day delay. And they still have not implemented batch corrections for colleges, which is how the colleges implement financial aid appeals or professional judgment adjustments. So that's apparently been delayed until this cycle, and who knows if it's actually going to get implemented. So we know that there's at least a 61-day delay for this year because it's not available until December 1st. And we'll see whether or not they actually fix the problems. If there are further problems, then we're going to see ongoing delays. Now, the first casualty of this is the college financial aid administrators. And yes, the students don't submit the FAFSA, but being a college financial aid administrator is an incredibly stressful job. And the U.S. Department of Education piled on, all this additional stress by the delays and then not having trustworthy timetables for when things would get fixed, and then things that were promised never got fixed. So we've seen a lot of financial aid administrators retiring, and there aren't enough people coming up in the ranks to replace them. So, that's going to have an impact on the counseling and support for students. Now, the students who are most likely to be affected by the FAFSA fiasco are low-income students, students who are first in their generation to go to college. So their parents didn't go to college, they're going to college. As I mentioned before, students who have parents, one or more, who aren't US citizens or permanent residents, and also disproportionately underrepresented minority groups. And these are the groups of students who most need the financial help from the FAFSA, as well as the counseling and other support from financial aid professionals. So the US Department of Education provided a little bit of relief to the colleges by delaying certain other unrelated administrative requirements until next year. But if they don't fix the problem this year, then they're going to need to do that again. And there needs to be funding for outreach on an ongoing basis. And they scrambled this summer to provide funding for a variety of groups to do outreach. And that's why we only had 10% of high school seniors and overall about 3% decline, down from 40% decline year over year in FAFSA submission. They maybe need to do that on a more permanent basis. But in long term, you're going to have the students who want to go to college and can't get financial aid because the FAFSA isn't working for them. Well, they're going to probably borrow money from private student loans, which means their financial circumstances after graduation, if they even graduate, are going to be much more severe. Because at least with the FAFSA, you could get the federal Pell Grant and lower cost federal loans. But you're going to end up with students who are more likely to drop out of college because of money issues. And if they do graduate, they're going to be graduating with student loan debt that may be much less affordable. And there's also this negative animus against higher education because the families are blaming the colleges, not the federal government, which deserves the blame. And so people are doubting whether college is worthwhile, and especially because they can't get through the door, let alone to the finish line. So, I mean, overall, we're going to have long-term negative impacts. And the only way to deal with this is to fix the problems first, and then provide funding to address and to provide more support to the students in terms of counseling and advising them on how to deal with the problems they encounter. And frankly, we need to have more grants. And so less loans, more grants, and replace loans with grants in the financial aid packages of students who demonstrate financial need. I mean, we need to immediately double the federal Pell Grant, and that could not only reduce debt at graduation, but also increase the number of students who enroll in college and who graduate from college.
Thank you for that answer. I really appreciate, I've heard 2 through lines, community outreach, and then also making sure that it's accessible to all. So I really appreciate that answer. And now I'll move to Angela as well, and I can reread the question for you too. What long-term trends in higher education could emerge if FAFSA delays become more frequent or prolonged, and how can we work to avoid the exacerbation of these trends?
So I'm actually going to do the negative and positive in terms of the long-term trends, because if this continues to perpetuate. And that is, the long-term trends is going to affect enrollment, is going to affect the culture, is going to affect the continued questioning of the value of higher ed for students, especially for vulnerable communities, of just like, what's the point? Like, we have enough on our plate. I don't need another hang up. I'll just get a job and figure it out. And that is just the reality that has been at question for quite some time. But I feel like every time that we feel like we caught our breath, like catching our breath post-pandemic and the declines of the pandemic, post the Great Recession and catching our breath after that, it's another blow that is coming from higher up that then impacts our ability to convince these families that we are looking to support to get out of the poverty cycle, to get out of some of the cyclical experiences that they're having because they don't have access to the credentials that's going to put them in a position to live viable livelihoods. So that is just where we at. I know these numbers for the enrollment numbers that come out this fall is going to be reflective of this reality. I had a lot of students that decided just not to go to college because they weren't comfortable with making that financial commitment and not know what money is coming in. Like, I still had students who did not have award letters when the school year started. So it's like, I'm not comfortable with that. Then you also have like our mixed status families that are kind of like, I don't want to put my family in a position where anyone gets in trouble. Like, I just rather not. I'll go get a job instead. And as long as we continue to put them in these positions to really question their everyday, in that moment livelihood, they're just going to opt out. And that's going to be a harder fight because that affects generations. That affects them if they have children, the messages that they give their children, so on and so forth. So we have to be very mindful of that. But from a positive standpoint, what I saw is more collaboration, all hands on deck, in a way that we've been trying. Like, I've been on the college access programmatic side for some time and have been fighting for this collaborative approach to supporting students, because it's not just going to take a high school. It's not just going to take a high school counselor or after school program. It's going to take everybody touching these families from all angles. You have parents who are uncomfortable with the aspect of taxes and not understanding how taxes work. Like, am I going to get in trouble? What does this look like? So having this come from employers, the city, the state, so on and so forth, and everyone feeding into this message of the value is what I did see an uptick on. And I just mentioned in one of our state strategy sessions in Michigan that that's one thing that I'm concerned is going to die out if it improves. Like, no one feeling like that they have to. Like in Michigan, we saw cities doing citywide FAFSA nights. We saw banks doing financial literacy nights along with FAFSA completion on site. Like, that is a beautiful thing that I've been wanting to see for a very long time, is everyone wrapping around these families. So that is the positive that did come out of this. You saw everyone feeling committed to actually making a difference in supporting these families despite the hangups. Now, how do we work to avoid it? This has been my message for a long time in the college access and success space: early awareness. We have to stop waiting until the senior year to give students information about making life choices. They're on the checkout. It's prom, it's homecoming, it's my last year in high school. Like, you have those really, like, I was a very ambitious student, but I also recognized like where my peers were. Being in Detroit public schools, for example, like everyone's minds weren't on like, let me make sure I cross all my T's, dot all my I's for my steps. It's like, let me enjoy this pivotal moment, because I may be the first person in my family to graduate. I may be like, there's a lot of other things that these families are juggling and celebrating, if that makes sense, in that senior year. And there's so much more that we can do with early awareness. Like, for example, I had my first college list in the 7th grade. How often are we seeing middle schoolers exploring where they can go and who they can be beyond just doctor, lawyer, teacher, but like, I can actually get my master's degree in knowing what a master's degree is and not a master's degree in basketball. So like, just bringing light to that, the more that we can get this information out early to students and families, the more that they can start building their awareness of what they need to be prepared for by the time the student gets to their senior year, that they're making informed decisions, that they know where the resources are and when to advocate for themselves. Because when you don't know what you don't know, so you don't know to advocate for a state resource if you don't know that it's something that's available to you. But if we do better with the messaging on the front end, not only do you curb like the hangups of like knowing the importance of the FAFSA, but you also curb students' understanding of how to take advantage of high school to their benefit and not to their detriment. Because what we see is 9th and 10th graders, you may bomb those first couple of years because you don't recognize the importance. And that leads itself to whether a student aspires to move forward or not. Like, I don't have the grades, I didn't do X, I don't think that this is the place for me. But if we catch them in middle school and elementary school and start building towards that, they know how to execute and position themselves when they get to high school. They know how to make better, effective decisions towards the future that they want for themselves, if they know that there's a future out there for them. So that would be like my message, in adding to what the colleagues here have uplifted, is that early awareness piece, and not waiting until the very last moment and then being frustrated when people don't show up, don't understand, asking questions, pushing back, because we're at the finish line. So what do you mean I have to do this? Or what you mean you want to see my personal tax information? Or what is all these other elements? Are you going to harm me? Are you out to get me? What does that like? But if you foster that relationship, that culture, and that sense of care, and that you want to see better for them early on, it will change the trajectory of how families approach the responsibilities and steps when it comes to that senior year matriculation and the time after.
Thank you. And thank you for that thoughtful response. And I greatly appreciate early awareness. So we have a few questions in our Q&A feature. And again, I'll remind the audience, you're welcome to just pose a question into that Q&A, and I'm going to ask as they come in, and hopefully we'll get to everything. So the first question, and this is for all of our panelists: what specific messages and resources do the panelists recommend for encouraging students from mixed status households to try again this year? And I'll leave it to whoever would like to answer first.
Well, the mixed status families, I mean, many of them started the FAFSA, and they weren't able to get it through it. So I think that the U.S. Department of Education has their contact information and needs to personally reach out to them and say, the problem you encountered has been fixed. They do that, then they'll potentially apply again, and also give them options for how they can get through and work around these problems. In some cases, they had to delete the FAFSA and then have the other person, the contributor instead of the student, or vice versa, complete the form. Or they had to have the person apply for an FSA ID before they were invited to complete the FAFSA. And there's dozens of potential workarounds. They need to share this with the families.
And I'll invite Dr. Ramirez or Angela to answer as well.
Sure, sure. One of the things that I think it's important for us to just remember that the immigration status of the parent does not affect the student. And I think that that continues to be a myth within communities. And a lot of times students are not even applying to financial aid because of that. So I think we need to just make sure that people understand that their immigration status of the parents does not affect the student or whoever, whoever's applying for needs to have an eligible status, but the parent doesn't really matter. So there's a process for that. One of the things that I have seen that has worked better, it's making sure that their names, so whenever the students and the families are creating the FSA ID profile or the FAFSA account, to make sure that they match, because a lot of times with names, it's I have seen people adding periods and dots and hyphens in places where that's not part of their legal name, right? So that creates problems. So I would recommend just paying attention to the names, the student, to make sure that they're using the parent's name as it is in their documentation. And also whenever they're trying to do the match, to make sure that they can go back to the FSA ID profile to make sure that they have exactly, because the system was really picky. Even if you had drive instead of DR or something like that, it would not match. So going back to the FSA ID, looking through the profile, trying to verify the account, and then kind of being able to move forward has been helpful. And I would recommend just paying attention to the names. That can help alleviate some of the connecting of the accounts. In terms of additional resources for mixed status families, just make sure that we have information in other languages other than English. So the language access piece, because even more important, that way families understand the why. So my colleagues mentioned like being transparent, right? Being transparent with the process, making sure that we have the sharing the information as it is available, but also having the caveat there that it changes all the time, right? And so families rather know information ahead of time than, even if it's bad news, they rather have the information ahead of time. That way they can make decisions for themselves and their families. So putting that agency on the families, and also to understand that the FAFSA is not just the only solution to paying for college, that the FAFSA is one of those tools within financial aid. So there are other ways, alternatives for students and families to think about college affordability. And the FAFSA piece is very important, right? But I think we also have to expand and include language in which can be open up, so that other students also feel like they do have an opportunity also for post-secondary education.
And I would just anchor on the transparency. Like, a lot of times we use messaging and things to attract and hope that there's an appetite to get student engagement and parent engagement. But when we're not transparent about the things that they would experience, like, you make the process more frustrating. And I know that the initial intent was like, we just want them to show up. We don't want them to be overwhelmed with the things. But when they get there and it doesn't work, and you're telling them to come back, and they get there and they keep running into hangups, and you don't know how to explain it, and then we're sitting on an hour call with the hotline, you create a norm with them that is like severing trust, not taking with full, like, is this really, are you about to bring me into something chaotic? It's been a stressful day at work. Like, these other elements that sometimes we don't think about in our positioning to protect students and families. So the more transparent you can be with them about patience, we don't know how things are gonna, like, it may have a hang up, so we may have to set up some additional time. Letting them know that up front will actually warrant them showing up for that second meeting that you need them to show up for. So that piece is very important in just fostering trust in general, when you're transparent and upfront with them about the possibilities of where things may go.
Thank you all panelists on that answer. And then Angela, we have one specifically for you. Dr. O'Donnell, how can we leverage community-based organizations to mitigate some of the stressors that you mentioned vulnerable communities experience around FAFSA completion?
While I greatly appreciate that, Angela is not quite a doctor. But the first is starting internally in terms of making sure your culture within is positioned to then invite these external folks in. Because sometimes you have a lot of mixed messaging that's happening within the doors of your respective space. So when you invite people in and there's kind of like mixed messaging, mixed ideas of how we're actually moving forward, that can create a dysfunctional relationship with external partners in those community-based organizations. But I would say do a landscape scan, see who is locally, like even in proximity to your respective school or organization, like 5 mile, 10 mile, and keep going out to identify who is doing this work and just reach out to them. Even your local institutions, like a lot of people don't know that a financial aid office will be more than happy to come in and do a FAFSA night, a financial aid night. There are a lot of institutions that actually do that. It may not be something that's listed on their website, but if you reach out to them and say, hey, is it possible that someone can come in and they'll identify someone? So it starts with the networking element of it. When you're in your respective spaces, asking questions, who does what, asking your colleagues that work in your same element of like, do you partner with anyone on these particular things? But then also looking at the ones who are already within your space. So you may have sports and all these other things, building them into the culture, making them part of the responsibility of making sure students are having these touch points, meeting with their counselors, like completing necessary steps so that way they're hearing it from multiple angles. Just imagine the basketball coach making sure that all of their senior athletes have completed the steps. Like that changes the trajectory of like how the messaging happened, and it's not just coming from one person. But beyond that, just landscape scanning, see who's out there in the college access success space, see who's out there in youth development, because it may not be college access and success. Look at some of your retirees that may be in the environment, because that was one effort that Michigan College Access Network did in Michigan. They provided stipends to retired counselors and teachers to come in and provide that support and advising around college access and success. Like be creative with it. Like, for example, Detroit Regional Chamber does a lot of work around post-secondary in the city of Detroit. So you never know who would engage and be part of that discussion, but just making sure that you align. Like Detroit Regional Chamber's value add to this is that you improve talent. And that's what helps them be able to inform employers the importance of telling their parents that work in the space, like, hey, don't forget this step in terms of supporting their students. So don't limit yourself on who to reach out to. Look very close to home, because a lot of times some of the especially vulnerable communities, there are a lot of people doing a lot of things already in that respective space. And you never know how you can leverage those people who have had similar experiences as students and would love to be able to volunteer, participate, come in and talk to a student, sit and walk through the process with a family in terms of completing a FAFSA. So that will be my note, is like leverage your network, take advantage of your respective community, take advantage of the colleagues that work in your actual space to see if they're working with anybody that they can recommend. But again, start locally, expand out regionally, look at the state level, and just reach out to some folks and see who will be willing. And then from there, make sure that you're fostering healthy relationships and following through and answering emails and things of that nature, because that can be a wall in relationships and people's showing up the next year and keeping longstanding relationships with you and working with your students.
Thank you. So our next question is from one of our attendees. I work at a small public school that's experienced layoffs in part from this delay issue. Do you have any guidance on how I can help our senior leadership and state governing body understand the negative impacts it's having so they can put pressure on the government? Is there any pressure that would resolve the issue? And any of our panelists can answer this question.
They should talk to their members of Congress and complain. And members of Congress pay a lot of attention to university and college presidents. And if they make them aware of the problems and the impacts, the members of Congress will then put pressure on the US Department of Education to address these problems. Hopefully they do get addressed.
So I would add to that and point back to the economy and how this overall impacts the talent, how this overall impacts the opportunity for job opportunities and advancing that respective economy, whether locally or at the state level. That has been a driving factor in a state like Michigan, in terms of like seeing like the value of students being able to move through the pipeline is that you're improving your talent pipeline. You're filling some of these work gaps, your employment gaps that exist in your respective state. You're improving discretionary income for families because that now they can reach a higher income with credentials to be able to spend in said economy. So like being able to anchor on the things that are important to them from a legislative perspective. So even when you're preparing for those meetings for legislation, looking at what's important to that congressman, like what matters to you the most, like what is the economy for you, is transportation for you, and it's like you tie your needs to that and why that is important on a grand scale for the respective state, region, local, in terms of that advocacy around it. In terms of the internal leadership, that can be advanced as well, just given what their priorities are within, like say at a school, for example. Like if their priorities is not, and they don't see the value in higher education, it will be a challenge to get them to advocate for those needs. But it's about continuing having the conversation about our responsibility to students and families and recognizing our part in the puzzle when we're at a school, for example, to make sure that students and families have what they need. And if that means you're anchoring on what you need as a department, as an office, as a team, as an organization, as a school, to then your leadership to say that this is important, but numbers is going to be, the data is going to be the key driver, and tying the data to what people prioritize for them in terms of their responsibilities and their role.
And I was gonna add the data. So there's some tools already, and I hope that most people know about these tools. There's what's called a FAFSA tracker, in which shares information about different communities and the FAFSA submissions and completions and things like that. It can even be localized into individual students completing FAFSA. So please use that. But the other piece that I was going to add, it's the inclusion of testimonies, the inclusion of stories, the inclusion of funders into the conversation of, college access. So one of the things that we do in our trainings is that we include government, we include business, we include parents, we include students, because in certain communities, for example, like in my community, in the Latinx community, parents are the decision makers. So if you don't see the parents as the decision makers, you're not gonna understand the power of the parent, right? So including other individuals, even like having your government individuals help you with FAFSA completion so they can see what it is to create an FSA ID. And after the fifth FSA ID they create, then they can think about like, maybe we should do something about this, right? It's not as easy as we think it is. So including people and testimonies, I think that's gonna add into the data and at the end of the day is priorities too. So the alignment of priorities into the budget, and sometimes they're making choices of not to include money for that particular purpose, and that also is a decision that people can make.
It's also a downward spiral. If the students can't get the money to pay for school, then they're not going to apply. And if you cut the budget too much, then they're not going to apply. So as you said, it's very important to have anecdotes, because a lot of legislation is driven by the anecdotes, not facts and figures.
Thank you all, and I liked how we uplifted the idea of having stories and anecdotes that we're taking to our policymakers, so thank you for sharing that. So our next question is kind of a question on whether or not we think we have confidence, or if y'all have confidence, or what your confidence level is that FSA's helpline staff will be equipped to help students with complex situations.
Well, let's look at where we've been. This past year, they cut the call center staff by 31%, even though they were rolling out a brand new FAFSA. And they recently announced that they had increased the staff by 80%. That's compared to this year. It's actually 70%. That is going to fall short. What they need to do is reverse a lot of the things that they did this past year. They need to restore evening and weekend hours, because people have to take off time from work or from school in order to call the center, the Federal Student Aid Information Center, 1-800-4FED-AID, and then they wait on hold for hours and hours. They don't have the time and resources to do that. They need to be able to reach someone within just a few minutes, not a few hours. And there needs to be a kind of one call promise where you call them once and your problem gets solved within that call. And not one of these, oh, we don't know what's going to happen, call back later, and they and the students left hanging. So it's really about trying to have a true customer service focus and training the staff so that they're able to answer the most common questions quickly and easily. They do have a system which captures scripts that for the most common problems. Those scripts need to be enhanced so that the call center staff know what to say beyond just their training.
Yeah, confidence level. There's actually like been issues with the helpline long before the rollout of the new FAFSA and the FAFSA delays. I just think that there needs to be a new consideration to the setup in general. And just a reminder to just not just make up answers to get people off the phone. And making sure that we're doing our due diligence, really like Mark was noting, really thinking about the customer service experience. Because if I call back 3 times and ask the same question and get different answers from each person, that's a problem. Like that, and that has been a long-standing problem in the space. Like I've literally had to, when I worked in financial aid, I will call to see what they're telling the family. And I'm like, yeah, I'm working in financial aid. That's actually not a policy or a procedure that is listed for Fed regs of how this works. And had the
They'll
correct
advise to do best 2 out of 3.
So with that, like I just think that they really need to consider the entire setup of that process. Maybe add in some more technology elements, AI, like do a little more as it relates to those supports for families and navigating basic, but also making sure that those are experts who are in the space to answer complex questions, because they are usually very unique to the person, and no script is going to lead you to the right answer if you're not really engaging with the understanding of what they're uplifting. So yeah, I'm kind of like here, like it's a line you can call to say that you talk to a person, but whether you're going to get those answers for complex situations, I'm not sure that that is going to be addressed.
That's my answer. Yeah, I do hope that there is more resources to support students with complex situations. It's getting more and more complicated for students, especially with special populations impacted by immigration, which is kind of the area that I work with, to be able to get quick answers about certain things that should be fairly simple. So they do have to rely on other people and other expertise from other individuals, which causes, those individuals to be overburdened with questions and things like that. But that should be a responsibility of the Department of Education and the FAFSA, just to make sure that they do have that expertise within, and then just leveraging also the financial aid offices. So we already talked about some of the challenges within the financial aid offices. But in this area, for example, I live in Western North Carolina, and so we do rely heavily on the expertise of our financial aid community, which has been awesome because they help us kind of navigate some complex issues. So thank you for that question, and I don't have a confidence either way.
And thank you so much. I wish we could keep this conversation going, but we're almost at time. So thank you, Dr. Ramirez. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Angela, for joining us for today's engaging and informative discussion. Before closing today's conversation, the Hunt Institute is sharing a link to our upcoming webinars. So next month, our post-secondary pathway series, we'll be partnering with our educator diversity team here at the Hunt Institute to discuss tribal colleges and universities and building an Indigenous American educator workforce. And that's occurring on November 21st. So we also encourage you to join us for any other of our upcoming Hunt Institute webinars, which can be found through that link provided. And you can register for these discussions by going to that website, which is in the chat. So again, thank you all for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye, everybody.